May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Musing this past week on Jesus' parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector reminded me of something that happened in the winter and spring of 1988 at the parish of St. Edward the Martyr in Spanish Harlem, where I did seminary field work, where I was a seminary assistant. A woman there, a parishioner, lost her husband. And then shortly after his death, her only child, a daughter, tried to take her own life. And I remember that the girl was still hospitalized in critical condition at the time. The woman was, and had been anyway, a regular churchgoer, a very active member of the congregation. Yet after her husband's death and her daughter's attempted suicide, she would not come into church. She would not cross the threshold. Instead, we would see her on Sundays standing by herself at the side of the entrance, smiling sadly and greeting others as they walked in. Despite the urgings of the rector, she would not attend Mass, but rather stood alone outside during the entirety of the liturgy in all types of weather, Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. As you might imagine, sometimes during the service, as the congregation rose or knelt, prayed or sang, I would sometimes think about her. There she was, standing at the base of the steps into the church, so close that she could hear the words and music, the shuffling of feet, the creaking of pews. Yet in her heart and mind, quite far away, lost amid her sorrows and worries. What she thought about in those moments alone outside, I don't know. But I wonder, was it guilt or shame that prevented her from coming into the church? Was it anger for what God had allowed to happen to her and her family? Or did she suddenly feel unworthy to enter God's house and to pray with all of us respectable people? This is not, of course, a perfect match with the story Jesus tells in Luke's gospel. I know that. The circumstances that prompted the woman to remain outside during Mass were not the same ones that compelled the tax collector to stand far off in the corner of the temple, beating his breast, asking for God's mercy. And as a whole, the attitude of the parishioners at St. Edward's was not that of the self-righteous Pharisee. In fact, more than a few people tried to comfort the woman in her grief and distress, and she was every Sunday remembered in the prayers of the people, as was her daughter. They were also remembered in our personal prayers. And I know that some looked into resources available to her, and who knows what else. It's just that I was moved by her suffering. And it made me think of the sufferings of all those who struggle at the margins of our world. people who feel unworthy, unloved, people who physically or symbolically stand far off and alone at the bottom of the church steps, as maybe we ourselves at times have done, maybe with good reason, when we have felt too afraid to pray, too ashamed to lift our eyes to heaven, when we have sought mercy that we did not think we deserved. And we may have felt all of this, having done half of what the tax collector in today's gospel was probably guilty of. For if we are to understand the shock Jesus' story had on his first listeners, and if we are to understand the nature of God's mercy, we need to realize what a tax collector did in the time of Jesus, and also what a Pharisee sought to do. The tax collector, a Jew himself, was squeezing money out of his fellow citizens so that a foreign power could continue to occupy their land. He was also, as common practice, dipping into those monies, lining his own pockets, while his countrymen slaved and scraped for everything they had. The tax collector in Luke's gospel would have been the kind of man capable of betraying a friend if there was a profit in it, the kind of man who kept multiple sets of books, the kind of man who would cheat the elderly out of their pensions or charge inflated rents for substandard housing. In contrast, the Pharisee would have been a man passionately in love with his country, his people, and his faith. His strict adherence to religious law was meant to be an example to others and a beacon of hope in a time of great oppression, a reminder that the sacred heritage had not been lost. The Pharisee, although a prosperous businessman, would have sought justice for the downtrodden and equality between the different classes. People respected the Pharisees, not because they feared them, but because they knew that the Pharisees cared deeply for Israel, for her traditions, her welfare, her future. But as sometimes happens with good people, some of these Pharisees began to believe that they were good. The respect they enjoyed became familiar, anticipated, expected. After a while, even their faithfulness to the law became self-conscious and artificial, so that instead of worshiping God, they were, without knowing it, worshiping themselves, worshiping God. And it's an old religious illness. The humility went out of their faith and was replaced by pride and contempt. They stood by themselves in the temple, away from their fellow man, aloof, self-contained. And this is where Jesus catches up with them in the form of a parable, or at least one of them, and with the tax collector too. And the repentant sinner goes home justified because he knows he is a sinner, maybe a wretched one, and because he hopes against hope that God will find a way to release him from his sins and help him to amend, to reform his life. He might go home, though, convinced that God has not heard him. He might go home lonelier and more lost than ever. The Pharisee, who has no reason to think of himself as acting in any other than a righteous way, well, he returns to his home unjustified in the sight of God. As content as ever, as close to God, he thinks, as before, but in reality as far away from God as he imagined the tax collector to be. And so Jesus, as he often does, assaults our sensibilities about what and who is righteous, as he attacks the prejudices of his own audience. For they thought they knew the right person to cheer for and the right one to hiss at. They thought they knew who wore the white hat and who wore the black. And let's be honest, we are apt to ask the same questions they did. How can a Pharisee, so clearly a man of God and a man of the people, turn out bad? Worse than that, how can a tax collector, a traitor, a parasite, society's refuse, turn out good? Well, Jesus switches hats on us, and really it's a blessing that he does. For you see, righteousness is not measured by a life manifesting marks of holiness, but by a life of moments in which we ask God to make us holy. And these are moments when we may not expect God to listen. Moments when, in sorrow and bewilderment, in pain and anger, when feeling lost and alone, we wait for answers in the farthest corner of the temple or even outside it. Moments when our hearts, weighed down by doubt and hurt and sin, are too heavy for us to bear. Moments when, unlike the Pharisee, we are not proud of what we've done. And when, like the tax collector, we simply don't know how to make it right. It is precisely in these moments that God finds us. For the outrageous quality of God's mercy is such that when we believe ourselves farthest from God, we are actually nearest. And when we feel ourselves most empty, we are most filled. When we think ourselves most wretched, we are most loved. For at these times we call on God not to validate what we've done, but to acknowledge our dependence on God alone. And then, with nothing more than fragile trust, hope against hope, we repeat the words of the prophet Jeremiah, "You, O Lord, are in the midst of us, and we are called by your name. Do not forsake us." And before these words even leave our lips, they are heard, they are acknowledged. I do not know what happened to the woman who stood outside St. Edward's on those Sundays long ago. I would like to think that those who tried to help her were successful, and that our prayers for her and her daughter were answered. I would like to think that one day she returned to her home feeling right with God. I would like to hope that she was able to discover something in the tangle of her mind and heart about how God was in her midst, her very midst, calling her by name, reminding her of his mercy and love, and inviting her as God invites us and all who come with humble and contrite hearts to feed on the strength and the courage and the glory of God's grace.